Alrighty, since we've talked about ecosystems and we've talked about food webs and we've talked about interactions between organisms and their environment, we're actually going to talk specifically about ecosystem stability now. So when we talked about ecological succession, that was a huge thing where we're talking about a constantly changing environment, right? Because either new land surface and it's bare rock for primary succession. And so things have to grow on it to create soil, and then more things grow on it and creates more and more more and more species diversity. So there's more and more species growing on that patch of new land. And in the end, it becomes a climax community. And a climax community is special because it's very, very stable. So the species aren't really changing, right? The ones that are there to stay. And the ones that are not really fitting there don't really get a chance ever to take root, because the ones that are already there best fit the environment. And so they're the strongest competitors and they always win. And so when you have a stable ecosystem, that's usually the ones we think of when we think of like, hey, describe a rainforest, or hey, describe a grassland, or think of a forest, right? Those are all actually the climax communities that we picture in our minds when we think about those. And those are stable because the things aren't really changing, right? When you think of a forest, you always think about lots of trees, maybe some grass, you think about deer, you think about maybe bears, foxes, you think about squirrels, but you don't really think about the fact that the forest didn't always look like that. And the reason we have a stuck picture in our head of what, for example, a forest looks like is because most forests are stable, and that's because they have ecosystem stability. So we're going to actually talk about some things that affect that and cause ecosystems to shift or change. So first off, make sure that your attendance form is completed. That's important so that you can get your attendance marked for today. The second thing is this Edpuzzle that you're currently on. The third thing is your interactive journal. So you should be working on section 2 for your interactive journal. And then lastly, you have an exit ticket. I'm pretty sure this one is a 3-pointer again. Make sure that you do these in order so that you can get the highest grade possible, because some of y'all are still working on the exit ticket right after the Edpuzzle. And that means you're not getting enough practice before you go and try to answer those harder questions on the exit ticket. All right, so our do now is what happens to a cycle if you remove a major step or player from within the cycle. I want you to think about, for example, in the carbon cycle or just a life cycle, right? In a food web, things kind of cycle too, right? Because you start from the sun where the energy producer, primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, maybe back to a decomposer, and then it goes back into nutrients. So what happens when you disrupt a cycle? Right, so usually when you disrupt the cycle, it causes a huge issue, and sometimes if it's a severe effect, it can even stop the entire cycle, right? Stopping cycles in nature is really bad because, like I said before, matter is never created or destroyed. It's just existing in different forms. And when you need to cycle those through different forms for usage in life or for usage to produce life as nutrients, if they start lacking in certain areas where they're supposed to be, right? If you need nutrients to produce more life, then if it's lacking, you can't actually grow the new life forms of like plants or something that you need to start a new cycle or to continue a cycle of moving the matter. So when you break or move parts of a cycle, then the cycle can either slow down or it can actually come to a complete halt. And that's actually really bad because, again, everything in nature cycles. So our learning objective is that students will be able to explain how do disruptions affect the components of an ecosystem. So let's think about a food web, a simple food web first off. And so disrupting a food web, right? We have our players, we have our, let me annotate for y'all here. So we have our, let me do a color that you can actually see. All right, so over here we have our producer, our primary producer, and that's gonna be these, let's call them sunflowers because they look like sunflowers. And remember that producers get a number 0. Yeah, I'm writing with a mouse right now, so this is kind of hard. And so as we go from the singular producer, it supports a bunch of primary consumers. So we have an aphid here, which would be a number 1, right? It's a primary consumer. We have a grasshopper here, which is also a primary consumer. We have a caterpillar, and then we have a grub or larvae of a beetle usually. Okay, so these are all the primary producers, and you see all 4 of these directly rely on this one singular plant source to get food and energy from. So that's probably a good hint for you that it's going to be important what happens to these plants, right? Now, the beetle larva is consumed by the mice. That makes the mice a secondary consumer. They're also consuming the caterpillars, they're consuming the grasshoppers, right? And then over here, you see the ladybug is consuming the aphid, which means that the ladybug is also a secondary. Now, consuming the ladybugs are these warblers, these birds. And so we have them as tertiary because they consume the secondary. But over here, we have, in this train, we have the producer, 0. We have the grasshopper, 1, eating the producer. And then we have the warblers also eating the grasshoppers, making them both a secondary and a tertiary consumer. So that's 2, 3 because they're both, right? So if we have owls eating these warblers because they're a bird of prey, they're going to be both a tertiary because they consume the secondary and a quaternary consuming the tertiary. So over here we have them as a tertiary and a quaternary consumer. Okay, and then up here we're going to have 0 going to 1, going to 2, then going to 3 here because the mosquitoes consume blood from the warbler. However, the warblers also eat them. So that would mean that if you're following a different trail over, you'll be able to find out another number on the warbler. We'll do that in a second. So if you follow this trail too, and you go from 0, 1, 2, 3, then that makes the mosquito also a 4. It's kind of crazy because, you know, mosquitoes are bugs, and we usually think of bugs being lower on the food chain, but actually sometimes they're pretty high depending on what they feed off of. From this side, we have a 1, 2, we have a 1, 2, we have a 1, 2, all right? And we're gonna also have a 0, 1, 2 over here for this, I'm pretty sure it's like an assassin beetle, right? It's a insect that eats other insects. So it eats larvae of other insects like caterpillars by injecting their spit into them, dissolving their insides, and then sucking their juices out like soup alive. And that's pretty crazy and pretty gross. So they're secondary. And if the mouse is eating them too, then the mouse is also tertiary. All right, so we see that the mouse's blood is also being consumed by the mosquito, which means that if we're following from the 2, the mosquito gets a 3, and from the 3, we also get a 4. Now, this is kind of weird because over here, we have a rare relationship between the warbler and the mosquito where it goes back and forth, which means that if the warbler is consuming the mosquito, the warbler is also going to be, it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. So this actually gets a we never really call it a 5, but pentenary maybe a 5th level consumer. But if you follow the 0, 1, 2, 3, and then the bird eats the mosquito, then it's also a 4. So this bird is a versatile player in this food web. It's got hex of levels over here. Okay. And I'll talk about the dragonfly last. So the dragonfly only eats the mosquitoes in this case, which means if it's a tertiary level mosquito, from depending on which food chain you follow up, it's going to get a quaternary level up here. And then if you follow the quaternary level at the mosquito around here, then this one also gets a 5th level. So after doing that, we've kind of numbered out each trophic level that each organism in this food web is in a position for. And this is important because you illustrate out and you number out the chains and see who is eating who, and then whose disappearance will affect who. Okay, because some of these animals don't have multiple food sources. And so if they don't have multiple food sources and their singular food source dies out, then what's going to happen to them? They're going to starve. And then if they starve, they're not going to be able to exist anymore, right? Let me change the color here. And we're going to see kind of effects now of when you take out players in a food web or a cycle of life. So a big, easy one to talk about is if we remove our producer. So say a virus comes through and it wipes out all of the sunflowers in this ecosystem. Now, if there is no producer in this ecosystem and there is no ability for the animals to pull sunlight energy, right? They all depended on the producer, either indirectly or directly. And if they all get wiped out, what is the grub going to eat? What is the caterpillar going to eat? What is the grasshopper going to eat? And what is the aphid going to eat, right? So if they get wiped out, then they get wiped out because they starve from not having a food source, right? And then if they get wiped out, they're a food source for other things too, right? So then the food sources for the mice are gone, right? The food source for the assassin's bug, which used to be the caterpillar, is now gone. And then the food source for the mice is gone because all of these things that the mice directly eats are dying, right? So if something happens at the producer level and all the producers get wiped out, then you end up with this huge issue of not having primary consumers that depended on those primary producers, right? And then not having primary consumers means that you're affecting the secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers. And then you're affecting the tertiary consumers that eat the secondary consumers. So if you have a base level effect at level 0 or the producer level, then you can completely destroy a simple food web. There are other ways to think about this too, right? So humans do a lot of studies on mice because they're house pests. So for example, in this ecosystem, if we were to say it's near a house, right? It's in like a neighborhood backyard kind of area, and people are having mice infestations inside of their houses and they're not happy. So they start putting out rat poison and the mice are slowly dying off from that. And once they get wiped out, then a few things are going to happen, right? Who did the mice used to eat? Right, if you look at the arrows pointing to the mice used to eat the grasshoppers, they used to eat the caterpillars, they used to eat the larvae, the grubs, and they used to eat the assassin bugs. Now, if the mice get wiped out and they're no longer eating these animals, that means their populations are going to increase because ain't nobody destroying their populations anymore. They are free to reproduce and grow in bigger populations. Now, if they increase in population, what's going to happen to the aphids? They all eat the same thing. So if these people over here are thriving and there's more than ever of them, then the aphid population is probably going to lose because there's so many like other insects that they has to fight for food with, and they might lose out. So their population is not going to get enough food and their population is going to diminish. Now, there's a lot of these insects eating this plant. On this other hand, you're also going to see that this plant is going to decrease because so many insects eating is not good for the plants. And if there's too many holes on the leaves, the plant can't do photosynthesis anymore and it dies. So if you look at just like intermediate factors of random parts of the food chain being affected, then you'll see impacts on both sides. So let's see who is eating the mice. One big eater of the mice is the owl. Now, if there's not that many mice left, does the owl have other food sources? If so, what is the other food source? That's right. If this relationship is no longer here because the mice are all wiped out, then the warblers are now the only food source for the owl, right? So if the owl population is trying its best to not decrease, it's going to eat more birds, which means that these birds' populations are going to go down because they're now the owl's only food source. However, it's a little hard for owls to adjust their predator habits to completely change the eating birds. So their population is still going to decrease no matter how many birds they eat. Okay, so again, if you think about it on both ends, if you affect an intermediate stage, say like a secondary or tertiary level, like a mouse, you're still going to get effects from the primary and producer level that are caused by removing this organism from the food web, and you're going to get upper levels with the tertiary and quaternary consumers affected by taking out this individual. So again, if you disrupt at different levels here, so in this food web, you see that there are multiple producers, and that is a probably a good thing because it makes the food web more structurally sound. So let's number these. Corn is a producer, it's a plant. Carrots are plants and they're producers. Flowering shrubs are also producers. And then trees are also producers. Remember that all of these producers have 100% energy that they're going to be passing, that they contain, right? And then out of that 100%, they only pass on 10 to their primary. So the deer directly eats the trees, the shrubs, the carrots, which means that the deer gets a number 1 because it's a primary consumer. Over here, the grasshopper directly eats the shrubs, so it also gets a 1. The rabbits are directly eating the carrots and the flowering shrubs, so the rabbits get a 1. And the mice are eating the shrubs, the carrots, the corn, so they also get a 1. Now, if you see the grasshopper, it's actually let's go from the side here. It's a little easier. So we go from the zeros leading to the 1 for the primary for the deer, and then the deer, the number 1, is going to be getting eaten by wolves, which means that wolves are a number 2 or secondary consumer, at least in this food chain, right? Over here, you can let's look at the grasshopper. So the grasshopper is primary because it eats producers. And the grasshopper is getting consumed by 2 things. The frog, which makes the frog a secondary, and the shrew, which makes the shrew a secondary. Okay? Over here, let's look at the rabbits now. The rabbits are primary, and the rabbits are getting eaten by 1, 2, 3 things. First is the hawk. So 0, 1, 2. The second is the snake. So we go 0, 1, 2. And then the third thing is the wolf that's eating the rabbit. So it's 0, 1, and 2. And we already have a 2 by the wolves. Similar for the deer. Okay. Over here by the mice, we're going to have it as 0, 1, and 2. So the snake is a 2 there. We're going to have a 0, 1, and 2 by the hawk. Okay. Now, we also have another food chain because we see the shrews now. They're a number 2. Sorry, this is not a very good number 2. So a number 2 being eaten by the hawk makes the hawk also a tertiary level, right? The shrew is also eaten by the wolves, which means that the wolves are secondary and tertiary. Is the shrew eaten by anybody else? We only see 2 arrows coming out from it, so no. Right here, we see that the snake is also eaten by the hawk, which means that the snake was a 2 and the hawk is a 3. And we already got that from the shrew, so that's good. We see that the frog is a secondary, and it's also eaten by the hawk. So this hawk is eating a lot of different things. And since it eats the frog, which is secondary, the hawk gets the 3, which is tertiary. We just want to double check all of our numbers to make sure that all of our organisms are marked with their correct trophic levels. So let's think about this now. So we're going to start eliminating organisms because of disruptions to their ecosystems. And we'll talk about factors that cause those disruptions soon. But for example, say the farmers chose not to plant corn this year in the cornfields. The farmers moved, so they're not planting anymore. And so this food source dies out for this ecosystem. Now, that's pretty bad, right? In the last one we talked about knowing that the sunflowers in the other previous food web, if they died out, they're the producer, then it's going to have big negative impacts on the food webs. Luckily, in this food web, we have 3 other producers, which maintains a little bit more ecosystem stability, okay? So you're not going to uproot and upend the entire food web just because the producer is removed, because there are other producers doing the same job. Now, knowing that there's less food from the corn, right, because the mice used to eat the corn, now the mice have to look towards other food sources like carrots and flowering shrubs more, which means that these populations are going to decrease a little bit because the mice who used to eat maybe 1/3 of corn, 1/3 of carrots, and 1/3 of flowering shrubs now have to eat 50-50 from carrots and shrubs because the corn that they used to eat, some of, is now gone. So they're going to be eating more carrots and more shrubs than the food web usually has them eating. So the environment's not really used to that. Okay, so these are going to decrease. Now, if these decrease, they're going to affect the other ones, right? The rabbit used to eat the carrots, and the rabbit used to also eat the flowering shrubs. And so the rabbit population is now competing with the mouse for the same exact food sources. And when they have competition, usually both of their populations will go down because they have to spend more effort trying to get the same amount of food that they used to. And spending more effort means using more energy. And so it means that they either have to eat more or they're not going to survive as well. Okay. On the other hand, over here, the deer isn't really affected because the corn is gone. So if the deer is not really affected, then the other ones aren't really affected either. So you can see that when you have more producers, the ecosystem is more stable when one or two of them gets wiped out, because there are multiple food sources that can support the primary consumers and therefore support the secondary and tertiary consumers. Now, you can also look at removing predators, right? So if the farmers in the area didn't actually move out, so they're still growing their corn, the corn's still here, but they're worried about their livestock being attacked by the wolves. So they start setting out traps, and the traps are killing the wolves. And so the wolves are dying. Now, the wolves are dying. That means that the things that they used to eat now have a bigger population because they're not being kept in check. Okay, so then the wolf population is no longer going to be eating the shrews. So the shrew population is going up, right? What else does the wolf eat? The wolf also eats the rabbits, which means that the rabbit population is going up. And the wolf also eats the deer, which means the deer population is going up. And so if these populations are going up, right, you can see already that the deer is a primary and the rabbit's another primary. That means that if there are increased populations of primary consumers, more producers are getting eaten, and the other primary consumers like the mouse and the grasshopper now have to compete harder for the same amount of food that they used to eat. And so if they have to compete harder, it's actually harder to survive because they got to, again, expend more energy and put more effort into finding food. And so they're going to actually not do as well because they have to fight and find food at a so much harder way compared to before, when they only had to like deal with a couple rabbits and a couple deer eating the same food. Right? So in the same level of primary, you see some ups and downs just because the wolf is gone. Now, the shrew increases, right? That means that it's eating more grasshoppers, which again is making the grasshopper population go down. So that's another way that you can find out the grasshopper population is going down, just because its predators are increasing a lot because the wolves are no longer eating its predators. Okay, so that's why the food chain, affecting any level or any organism in a food chain, has these cause and effects that can drift down really, really far down the line, all the way back to the producers or even further up. But here we did an apex predator. And so let's talk about some effects on the ecosystems that actually cause these things to get wiped out. We did mention, for example, human impacts like farmers and people just not liking having certain animals in an area, so removing them. And that's actually really disruptive and really bad. So some examples of disruption factors. So we talked about climate change in the last Ed puzzle, right? So changing temperatures cause animals to not be well fitted for living there anymore. The example that a lot of people think about is polar bears. Okay, so polar bears live on the Arctic ice caps, and they require ice to hunt, right? If the ice doesn't spread out far enough into the water, then the ice isn't going to reach where the seals are. And the polar bears almost extensively eat seals, right? They'll hunt other animals during different times of the year, but their best source of food and best source of fatty food to help them survive the cold weather are the seals and their blubber. So the polar bears either have to migrate down to where the ice is, they have to migrate to where there's new food sources. So they're going to be migrating south into areas where there used to be grizzly bears, and polar bears are way bigger than grizzly bears. And so they become an invasive species. And that's really bad because then the natural habitat in like the warmer areas down south are now being affected by a new apex predator. And it might outcompete because nobody else is going to fight these polar bears because they're so big. So they're going to eat whatever they want to, and they're going to destroy the ecosystem by eating the things that maybe the normal grizzly bears were keeping in check at regular levels. And some will try their best to survive. So there are actually these really sad pictures like on National Geographic of these starving polar bears because since they can no longer hunt, they get so thin to the point where they can't even keep their bodies warm anymore. And they're so tired and skinny from breaking down their own muscles that they're just collapsing and dying on the leftover ice that doesn't actually reach far enough for them to go hunt. And so this can cause, like, again, the apex predator in the Arctic to die out because they can't eat anymore, which means that seal populations, because they can still swim wherever they want to go swim, are going to increase severely. And then we have an overpopulation of seals. And you have issues with that because then their food sources start declining because there's so many of them eating it. We also have pollution, again, another human effect, right? Chemicals will spread through the wind and the water. And we'll actually talk about biomagnification, about pollution soon. Obviously, pollution can just directly kill environments if it's super, super toxic, right? A lot of big name brand companies find it cheaper to dump their chemicals in the nearby water sources instead of processing them legally and cleanly so that they're not affecting the environment. And that can literally just kill an ecosystem by killing all the animals from toxic exposure. And that's pretty crazy. Ecological succession, I mentioned in the very beginning, right? After a natural disaster, like a wildfire, a tornado, or hurricane, life will come back and grow back. And during that time, the species diversity is not consistent. It's not stable. But at the very end, when you reach the climax community, it's nice and stable, and it stays like that for a long time until another natural disaster comes through, and then you experience ecological succession again. Deforestation, another human impact, getting rid of trees, right? By getting rid of trees, you're getting rid of a producer, which is the supporting level, again, in a food web. You're also getting rid of habitat and home if you get rid of forests. So we talked about limiting factors, right? If you get rid of a lot of trees, that's a lot of shelter and a lot of food for organisms, and that takes the carrying capacity and drops it way, way down. So if you drop the carrying capacity, animals can't live, not as many animals can live in the same area as before because there's less food and less shelter. Biomagnification. Okay, so that is chemicals get more concentrated in higher trophic levels. Okay, again, biomagnification. So in life forms, magnification of chemicals happens as you go up the trophic levels, magnification or increase, right? So for example, I spray pesticides on my lawn. And pesticides are on the lawn and the grass, and that's trophic level 0, right? So say I have 600 grasses, right? I have 600 grasses, and so each grass gets one chemical on it. And that's 600 grasses with 600 chemical. Okay, so each grass only gets one chemical, right? That's why the 1 is circled over here. It's not that bad, right? The grass is living fine. It's got one chemical in it. It's not a big deal. But then you have rabbits, and you have, let's say, 5 rabbits. And the 5 rabbits eat all of this grass. So they each eat about 120 grasses, right? 5 rabbits, they each eat 120 grasses. Remember, each of those grasses contained one chemical in them. So now if one rabbit ate 120 grasses, it also ate 120 chemicals. So in each rabbit's body, there is 120 particles of a pesticide, which is really unhealthy, okay? But it gets worse. So these 5 rabbits are prey of foxes. This is a very shoddy drawing of a fox, but we're gonna go with it. And so in trophic level 2, where it's foxes eating the rabbits, one fox can eat 5 rabbits, no problem. And that means that every single rabbit containing 120 particles of chemical is being eaten by this fox. And so 5 times 120 is 600. So in this one fox's body, there are now 600 particles of chemicals, right? Down here in the grass, each grass only had 1 particle. But just going up 2 levels to a fox, now each individual fox has 600 particles of chemicals. So as you can see, as the level goes up, the chemicals are also going more concentrated and going up in levels, right? Biomagnification. So in this life form, the magnification has went from 1 to 600 particles of chemicals, and that's pretty bad, okay? So these are some examples of how ecosystem stability can be affected and some factors that actually do the affecting. So I want you to think about these as you move on to your interactive journal and then your exit ticket for today.